today's show.
I'm chewing on it, I'm mulling on it, I'm thinking, I'm reading, I'm absorbing, who knows? But it was really interesting how hard it was for me, that process. But so I started having all these conversations with people because I was interviewing them. I said, I want to include other people's stories. And I knew a lot of women who had really interesting stories of being entrepreneurs, of being parents, of being makers. And then something shifted. It was like another kind of, wait a second moment. I need to have these conversations out loud in front of other people. Because I'd call someone up, I'd have this amazing conversation. I'd be transcribing it, because I thought it had to be in this one format of words on a page. And then I'd feel so great afterwards because I'd get to see what somebody else was doing and I'd learned all this new material. And then I was trying to figure out where to put it. And it felt like waiting 3 years to get it into a book, to maybe not even have it, was just a waste of time and energy. And there was this valuable asset that started to emerge, and that was these conversations. I said, well, what if I just buy a $99 blue microphone, put it on my computer and record these and make a podcast? Like, what if, right?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Koester.
What if you don't finish? It's a question that I get asked a lot from someone who's starting something new. They're going to start a podcast season or a book or an event series. What if you don't finish? On today's episode, we're going to talk to Sarah Peck, who is someone who I met years ago. And early on, she described how she was starting a book. It's 5 years later after she started that book. It still hasn't been published, but yet she's had some remarkable insights and turned those insights into a podcast, a business, an entire kind of platform called Startup Pregnant. It's a fascinating conversation to understand that sometimes the creation event that we think we're going to have may surprise us. And for Sarah, that's exactly what's happened. She still may someday publish that book that she set out initially to publish, but right now she's loving life, having adventures of starting the new podcast, Startup Pregnant, the adventures of building a business around it, the challenges of being a mom, and more importantly, the opportunities to create something awesome. Here's my journey and my adventure today with Sarah Peck. So excited, Sarah Peck. Gosh, we've known each other for a while now, and it's exciting to sort of have, over the last couple years, to have watched you really tackling something that I've been going through too, which is sort of being a parent in the startup world we're living into. And so I'm excited to talk about kind of your adventures in establishing this entirely new thing, Startup Pregnant.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You are welcome. You are welcome. So I want to start with the sort of the premise behind kind of the book idea that you started with. We'll go a little bit further, but kind of tell me why this was something you felt compelled to talk about, because I think there is this sort of mentality out there that it's like, startup is work hard and like you stay all night and like that sort of thing. And yet there's a huge number of people that don't fit in that mindset. So tell me why this it was inspiring to you to kind of start to share.
So I think it's been 2.5 years now. I came up with an idea called Startup Pregnant, and I wanted to write a book about it. And the idea came to me because I was working at a startup and I was pregnant. So, and it was in the 5th or 6th month. Shocking. Like, whoa. And I just put the two words together. I was like, and it was kind of a joke in the beginning. It was Startup Pregnant only for the insane, because it was challenging and it was hard. I struggled a lot through the pregnancy, and I, like with any life event, right? It asks you questions. Who are you? What are you doing? What's changing? Who supports you? How do you do this? And I felt so nervous and uncertain, and I wanted to create both like a reason for why I was going through what I was going through, but also a perspective on and a guide for people of like, here's a different way of doing it. And what emerged really, the core philosophy of Startup Pregnant, as I know it today, is the idea that we don't have to do work and we don't have to do parenting the way it's always been done before.
Yeah. So I want to read from a quote, or I want to give a quote that you wrote about not that long ago, sort of as you described the evolution behind it. Because I think, again, I think that there's probably a lot of, even my wife talks about this, is when she was trying to find, she's a professor and she was trying to find guidance. There's a lot of sort of niche places that are about, stay at home or have a nanny. There's like all these like advice, but I think, like you said, there are bigger pools of people that need it. And I think you wrote this that I was sort of inspired by. I said, almost 2 years ago, the idea for Startup Pregnant came to me. But when the idea first arrived, it was to be a book of my own experience. You go on to say, over time, however, the idea morphed from a book, still in progress, to grow in shape and size. It became bigger than a book. But like my kid and his clothes, he's constantly outgrowing. The book quickly outgrew the container of a book and asked me to make something else. So tell me that journey of like what it was like to start the process of a book and how it's kind of evolved since then over the last 2.5 years.
I'm so glad you're asking this because it's so often we see the end product of something and we think like, oh, well, that must have been easy. The idea came to them and they made that thing. And it was easier to make a kid than it was to make this book, which is still not finished. But like, let me peel back some layers because I reached out to a really well-known agent here in New York City. I was astonished when she asked me to come into her office. I felt like totally out of my league, if you will. And I pitched the idea. I was sweating terribly because you get super hot when you're pregnant. And it was like winter and I had a coat and a belly and I didn't have the right clothes because like you're changing body size. And I pitched the idea. She's like, great, get me a proposal. And oh, crap. Okay. So I wrote a proposal and I sent it in and then shortly thereafter had a child, took maternity leave for about 3 months. While I was on maternity leave, wrote more of it. For some reason, I didn't want to shower, didn't really interest me, but I did want to write. So I went with it. I wrote about an hour a day. There's not much, you don't have much time on maternity leave, really. It's not a vacation or a holiday. It's like pooping, cleaning, breastfeeding, changing diapers, sleeping for 3 hours. But that 1 hour a day when I had some coverage from someone else, I was like, I'm going to write really quick. And I ended up, so I sent the next draft in and I had these optimistic ambitions that like by the time my kid was 6 months old, I'd have this book deal. Which is really, I'm smiling right now, kind of laughing at myself. I wrote 5 or 6 different versions, some of them 20,000 words long. So the process of creation behind it, I was constantly making things, but we never quite got the book right. And every time I developed it, I learned more about what the project was. And I said, oh, I've got to talk to more people. And I want to start having more conversations with women about their experience. Because honestly, let's call a spade or whatever the right phrase is. I'm a white, privileged, educated, married, straight-ish person who has a lot of support and help, and I got a paid maternity leave. So the reality of my experience is that most of the world doesn't have, or most of America doesn't have this. So when I'm writing this, if I'm writing a book from my perspective, quite frankly, it sounds kind of snobby and elitist and annoying. I'm like complaining about some stuff, and it wasn't going over very well. And I had to do some also integrity searching of like, what is it that I'm really trying to say? I feel like there's something important here, but I'm not getting it. And my story, it's not like I didn't save the world here. I just made a child. Like there's a lot of people that are like, I did that too. Well, come on.
I think even if you think about it, I mean, I would just, from my perspective of even searching for advice and guidance, it is for the most part, this is my anecdotal experience. And then you should do what I did. And I think it's really fascinating to think like, why does your anecdotal information, should I follow yours versus everyone else's? And that is something I know that we wrestled with because the ease of creating your own blog and putting stuff out there has almost made it that it's hard to even know what to do. And my wife's sort of a very data-y person. And she was like, if I Google anything, I'm going to get in this rat hole where I'm going to be frustrated. And so I think there's a sort of other things going on here that the ease of creating something mediocre has gotten so easy that you probably even had to level your own, sort of think of the way to level this up as you were coming and approaching it.
Right. And take some of the ego out of it of like, okay, it's useful for each of us to tell our own stories because we learn ourselves. But does my story need to be told at scale as some sort of, what's the word? Like dictum? Like is it some like methodology? No. And I love that you just said that about, we often take our own experience and then distill it into like, and here's how you can do it too, which I'll call, do you allow swearing on this podcast?
Yeah,
what do you
please.
think? All right.
Fuck yeah.
I'll call BS on that. Ha ha ha. Bullshit is what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So I want to call, that's one of the biggest problems of our entrepreneur and Inc. magazine culture, the how I did it culture. And the problem here is, and I love your wife already because she sounds like a science geek and a awesome research geek. And well, I assume you like her too, you know? Yeah. But the thing that drives me nuts is that number one, we assume that people have accurate memories.
That's right.
And we know from science that that's not true. So first we are assuming that people know that they can recall what happened and accurately tell you the truth. And there's many reasons why people wouldn't tell you. Like if they lied, cheated, and stole in order to get what they got, and then they became very successful. Well, what are the odds that they're actually going to tell you that's how they did it? Second of all, we assume that the exact conditions that they're in. So in lab science, it's like the control group or the methodology or is it repeatable? We assume that those criterion surrounding the actions are also replicable. Like, oh, you're going to just happen to be in 2008 again when the market was shifting and changing and be able to do the exact same steps. So even if they're telling the truth, if you do the exact same steps again, can you get the same results? Also not a guarantee. And science sample sizes of one aren't really that useful. We can do a lot of case studies and we can learn from them for sourcing ideas and inspiration. And that's what we should do when we look at individuals' experiences. But we can't take it and say, here's the methodology based on one data point. All right. Now I'll get off my science soapbox.
No. But I think it is important because I think what's interesting about just distilling your journey is you went after this from, I'll write a book because I didn't find an answer. And what was sort of interesting is you kept pulling on this one and saying like, I'm creating things, but is it really going to advance me and advance us where this should go? Right. I think that's it's interesting just thinking about you as a, sort of your own creator story is you're basically saying like, you're iterating on yourself as you're going, saying like, all right, where does this actually go? And that's, I think what we see a lot in creators is they're listening back for those sorts of things. And so I love it that you were like, hey, listen, I've got stuff out here, but I got to keep iterating. So where does this take you from here when you start to have these moments of crises of your 5 drafts in now and saying like, this still isn't there? Yeah.
And thanks for asking, because there's so many interesting pieces that happen. Like that you turn a corner and you're like, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen next.
Right.
And before we turn into what it morphed into,
right.
I will say that like one of my own personal learnings was that surprised me was I would turn in a draft and I would get feedback, and I was surprised like how devastating it felt to get feedback that it wasn't working. Right. And I thought, I think of myself, right? These are the psychological distortions we carry. I think of myself as like, keep going. Like you can just do this. You bounce back. And it really took me 2 to 4 weeks every time I got feedback to get back into writing again.
Yeah.
And after, 6 iterations of that, now I have 6 data points that tell me I have something to learn about getting back into it. Or maybe it's part of the process, right? Like I'm chewing on it, I'm mulling on it, I'm thinking, I'm reading, I'm absorbing, who knows? But it was really interesting how hard it was for me, that process. But so I started having all these conversations with people because I was interviewing them. I said, I want to include other people's stories. And I knew a lot of women who had really interesting stories of being entrepreneurs, of being parents, of being makers. And then something shifted. It was like another kind of, wait a second moment. I need to have these conversations out loud in front of other people. Because I'd call someone up, I'd have this amazing conversation. I'd be transcribing it, because I thought it had to be in this one format of words on a page. And then I'd feel so great afterwards because I get to see what somebody else was doing. And I'd learned all this new material. And then I was trying to figure out where to put it. And it felt like waiting 3 years to get it into a book, to maybe not even have it, was just a waste of time and energy. And there was this valuable asset that started to emerge. And that was these conversations. I said, well, what if I just buy a $99 blue microphone, put it on my computer and record these and make a podcast? Like, what if, right? And I said, okay. So around June of 2017, I said, okay, I'm making a podcast. We got a tiny bit of money for it. We asked for some sponsors. We got some, enough to cover cost, about $500 a month. So I could pay for somebody to edit the podcast and pay for the hosting costs. And I started this show. And then I was like, well, I'm doing a thing. I'm making a product. I have money coming in for it. I have people I'm paying to do work for me on it.
Right.
I don't know. This smells kind of like a business.
Yeah, exactly. Wait a second.
Yeah. And it was like I was doing Startup Pregnant and I thought it was a book, but there was this secret startup that was happening instead. And I was the last one to realize.
Yeah. It's amazing that, and I think you're actually doing customer discovery by creating it. And I actually think that one of the weaknesses in sort of the broad customer discovery stuff, and you're like, you're deep in this world too, is that we don't actually like force ourselves to go deep enough until you have to write it and create something to explain it to other people. So we always surface level customer discovery versus when you're actually thinking about sharing it through a book, you're like, you actually have to go deep enough to explain it to other people. And you're like, wait a second, this is different than I thought.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think you're not unusual. And this fact that like the depth that you needed to actually build the business probably wouldn't, if you set out to build this business, you probably wouldn't have ever gotten the depth versus going through the book route or creator route and creating a podcast. The depth sort of emerges suddenly.
Right. I love that you're talking about making, like just go make the first version of it, make something, because the act of making it is going to give you, it's effectively going to give you a whole lot of questions, right?
Right.
Do I have enough material? Can I talk about this thing? Does my brain even make sense? Like how do I organize it? And like, what do I need to do next? And writing in many regards, especially writing things that are longer than 10,000 words, starts to require a different type of systems thinking, like organizational, structural thinking. Because now you're starting to think about how do these ideas relate to each other? What's the overall arc? What stays? What goes? What's the core message of the book? There's a thing in writing called the through line. And it's, what's your book in 2 sentences? And originally mine was, girl goes to work at a startup, girl gets pregnant, girl tells the world how you can do better startups by lessons she learned from pregnancy. Right? Like you get the gist of the book. You can grok it in like a sentence or two. What's the through line? And so all of these pieces, like, and I really thought, I mean, I think this is something that every single writer says, right? But I really thought that it would be easier to write a book than it has been. Because I was like, well, I've written like 700 blog posts. Like, why I just got to write 100 more? I thought it wasn't going to be as challenging, but the complexity when you get up in word count and you start to organize the system, it really does challenge you in a new way. And I think it deepens your thinking and it requires you to really have mastery over some material, or it shows you what you need to do next.
To that point, it's interesting to think, what's kind of been the reaction since you sort of made this move towards conversations? I mean, it's been interesting if you look at sort of the Startup Pregnant site, you've built this community. And in fact, you've built, you're building backers and things like that. How has it been like to sort of realize you're building kind of a community-driven media empire? Is it sort of like, did that part come naturally, or was it sort of the content sort of led you where you needed to go?
Both. So I think one of the things that's a challenge is there's so much out there, it can be kind of overwhelming. It's like, I can make everything. Well, I'll have a podcast and I'll have a website. I'll have a blog and I'll have all this other stuff. I'll have an email list and I'll make a Facebook community. And that kind of dilution really can be problematic.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I was really conscious about what I was making with the website, even though it still feels like I'm not a first draft, but like a third draft right now. It still feels like it's a work in progress, but I was really conscious about it. And this might be interesting. A podcast as an audio form, like an audio, think of it as a thing, right? The MP3 or whatever it is as a product. A lot of times with a product, we can hold it in our hands, a phone, right? The phone that you use every day, the water bottle, the cup. An audio file is actually really hard to share.
Yeah.
Right? Like you want to give somebody a cup of coffee and you're like, here, I'm giving this to you. Maybe hard to do digitally. So you would send dollars and a gift certificate. But an audio thing is really hard to share. So when I thought about the podcast and I thought about how does this get to people, audio as a form can have its own challenges in shareability, especially because and here's a business idea for you, most of the ways that we listen to podcasts, the Apple Podcast Player and Overcast and Stitcher and Google Play, all of those, this is how geeky I got in building this, by the way. This is the kind of research that you do. So all of those different pieces are, they're not great.
Yeah.
Like you would think, given our technological prowess in today's day and age, that you would be able to share a specific moment in an audio clip. Be like, hey, listen to this at 8:11. But you can't. You would think that you would be able to tweet out a specific episode. It's really hard to do.
Yeah.
When you tweet the link from Apple Podcasts, you just link to the podcast show page. So all of these little pieces, I was like, okay, here's a challenge with the thing that I'm doing. So I made something that's infinitely more shareable, and that is a web page for each podcast episode. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I do. I see it. Yep.
Yeah. So that was intentional. We don't have a blog, even though it blogs every Monday.
Right.
We have a show that goes live on Monday, and we have a website that shares how to listen to the show.
Huh. I think it's in some ways there is more than it's not just a podcast, right? It's become sort of basically it's become a community, and different people will access that and share it differently. I mean, I think one of the things that I found when I was just sort of researching for this is you basically could. It's almost like you write an in-depth blog post that you don't even necessarily have to listen to the podcast to get a ton of depth out of it. I was, I listened to and was watching and reading about your interview with Nicole Walters, who's the entrepreneur from Monetize, which is awesome, by the way. It was fun to listen to, but like
she's she's hilarious,
so funny, so good. But I think what I thought was just so interesting about this is you read the preview, the blog post, and you're like, now I want to read more. So you create this like unique way to really experience the relationship that you create with these guests.
Well, and so there's strategy behind that too. And I think I'm going to assume that everyone listening is a huge geek like you and I are.
Of course.
So let's get into it, which is audio is also not searchable. So when you think about Google as a search engine and you think about like how are things shared? Well, part of it is the database of search engines, and part of it is the social community aspect. It's really hard to share it. So I wanted to create enough copy for each podcast that it would register on the indexes that search these things.
Interesting. Yep.
Yeah.
So one of the things I also wanted to ask you about was you've used Patreon as the sort of this platform a little bit, which I think that people are seeing this. For those who don't know, it's kind of a patronage approach to supporting people and brands and things like that you support. What was that like to sort of realize that maybe there's a different way to build an audience and to build a sustainability around the program?
Yeah. So we originally did all of our sponsors and our listeners on Patreon, and we're currently in the process of switching. All of our regular sponsors are going to be billed. I mean, we use PayPal, but you can use anything, right?
Yep.
We're going to move them over to a bank billing system, mostly because I want to move off the monthly cycle and into longer contracts.
Makes sense.
So and Patreon was hard to do other than a monthly. You have to kind of set it up. So we're going to be moving into quarterly and half yearly contracts, which is really great because it creates more business stabilization. And I'm not in a monthly sales cycle, but I'm doing it every 6 months, which is as a mostly solopreneur at the moment and a mom is great for the brain. Like this is how I make my decisions. It's like, do I have to do this every month? God, okay, nope. Like I'm moving to 6 months, like buy in and just create stability. And then Patreon is going to be our listener-backed radio. So you can sponsor us for like $1 a month or $4 a month, or I think the max is like $25 a month. We have a lot of people who really like the $4 a month one because the description there is like, buy me a cup of coffee every month. Yeah. That's your commitment to me. And it takes more than one cup of coffee.
Right. I drink more than one cup of coffee at a minimum, people.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you find that one of the things I think also, the word startup is in your brand, your podcast, what you're building. Do you feel this pressure that sort of like, all right, we got to scale this thing and like this has to be massive and it has to be the next blah, blah, blah. how do you balance that? Because you're also, you are a mom and you are trying to like be a solopreneur. How have you sort of like played through this in your mind a little bit to be comfortable with where you are and where this goes?
Yeah. So this is such an interesting question, and one that's like, I call it a chapter in my book because the question is still a little bit unanswered.
Right.
But there's a whole world out there in which startup means a very specific thing. It is something that's rapidly growing. You probably have a better definition. You teach this, right? But
modestly, not very good. No,
but like,
I remember I tried to quit, so remember, I'm not a good example.
But okay, yes. Okay, right. But like, think of the hockey stick growth curve.
That's right.
There are venture capitalists. Venture capital is a relatively recent phenomenon. Like in the history of what? 1980s, right? 30 years, 37 years now. And it's really recent that we started putting a lot of money and making bets on things that are called companies and wanting these companies to grow to huge multi-million, billion-dollar valuations. And so there's this glamour that comes with the word startup. And also, there's a lot of like battling over the word entrepreneur. What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? Are you really one if you just have a small business? And I chose deliberately to take the word startup because I think starting anything up from scratch, including with the lens of family, right? Like you're starting a family. I love the phrase 0 to 1. And like literally that's what you're doing when you make a human.
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest times of your life. So I wanted to capture the spirit of what it takes to grow something from scratch and how that applies to both business and to families. So are we talking about the like sliver, those like the 2% of companies that become unicorns? No. I mean, yes, we include them in our purview, but we don't limit ourselves to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I oftentimes always see this, again, you've been a part of the sort of that fast growing, quote unquote, I'm going to call it capital S startup world, and been in those type of companies. What was the point in your mindset that flipped from, hey, I'm going to be using this Startup Pregnant as a book or as a podcast, sort of a fun type of thing, to where like, this is like the thing on your LinkedIn bio that you're doing, right? Like what is the point when you sort of said like, all right, this is it? Was there a point and how did that sort of evolution happen? Because I even find it with myself, right? I mean, I've never seen myself as like a professor. It's sort of just something I did on the side. And it was sort of recently where I sort of started to embrace it and be like, you know what, this is what I love doing. This is what I want to keep doing. How did that experience go for you?
Okay. So this is an interesting question because it's really relevant to right now in a way that makes me really nervous.
Yeah.
What did we do? So I left my job in 2016, where I was helping to run operations for a startup and do a lot of the communications work. They had neither a CMO or a COO, but I kind of operated in both of those spaces because we were small enough that you don't give everyone a C title because that's a silly thing to do if you're that little.
4 people, 4 Cs.
Yeah, 4 people, 4 Cs. Well, let's take 2 sentences and talk about why that's a bad idea. And that's if you start everyone at the top, everyone you hire has to be below you. And really take a little of the ego out of it and know that you would be so lucky to hire somebody smarter than you to help grow this thing.
100%. Yeah. 100%. People's the only thing that matters, but you want to hire people who say, I'm better than you, but I'm coming with you. So
100%. Like if I start something and then I end up like I would be lucky enough to be a VP in a company that I started if it were doing that well, and we needed like somebody who could run a 500-person organization. I don't have enough ego to say that I'm the person that's best at doing that. Like it would be amazing. Think of it like a discovery tree where there's choose your own adventure. It would be amazing if the path were that I were able to grow that fast to be able to do that role and to do it well. But I don't want to hold us to that kind of risk.
That's right.
Okay. So wait, now remind me of the question you were asking before.
So this when you decided that this was the place for you to focus, this like podcast is the place you're going to invest, and I made you uncomfortable thinking about where you are.
That's why I lost the question.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me take it somewhere else. Okay. So when I left my job, then I financed most of 2017 by continuing to run. So I've done consulting for a long time, about 8 years now. And I put together a mastermind program. So I ran a leadership accelerator on my own through my own SKP media company. And most of that was used, I just took that money and put it right back into building Startup Pregnant. I was self-funding, which was great. 2018, we're recording this on January 18th, 2018. I just finished my annual reflection and my budget. And I decided not to run my regular programs this year because I think there's a chance to fund all of Startup Pregnant and our family's needs by the end of the year. There's also a chance that it won't work.
Right.
We are fortunate that we are in a place, my husband and I, what we've done for full transparency, I think, because I don't think it's helpful when entrepreneurs are like, oh, I funded it myself, but I have a partnership and he makes the money. So, so what we have done in our lives since we've been together is we've always agreed that we want to be able to live off of one person's salary so that the other person can pursue meaningful projects. Whether that's creating a book or like my husband's a really great developer and a creative director. And there's going to be times in his life when he wants to just make an app because it has to be a thing. And so we go back and forth on who gets to have the chance to make something that we think needs to be built in the world or is starting something up. And for me, that book /podcast /business is that thing. And unclear what it is. But we have pretty good agreements as a partnership of like, well, how long and how do we know? And so I've got metrics I've got to hit by the end of the year. The good news is that we're going to know if it's working really fast. Like this is a 6-month to 12-month kind of scope thing. It's like, is it working or is it not? And we've got metrics by the end of the year that we're going to try to hit. And the reason we killed all my other programs was actually to up the risk, to up the kind of accountability. And now it's up to me to get sponsors for this thing. And I don't have distractions every day of like, well, you know what? I really had to run my mastermind and I had to do all of this like freelance writing for these like fancy schmancy clients. And I didn't have time to build it. That's why it didn't work. That's gone. That's no longer, and I'm like, I can feel my stomach tightening up a little bit as I'm saying that out loud because it's really scary.
Yeah. But we talked about earlier before we got on the power of constraints to know, like to sort of focus the mind. And I feel the stomach in my knot, or the knot in my stomach too, hearing you talk about it. But I also feel at the same time this sort of like excitement, enthusiasm, and hopefulness, because I think to your point, you'll know.
Yeah.
And that's better than sort of being in this like, well, like, is this like a fun project or is this the thing? And I think you are early in the game in some ways of saying like, can I build a community-based media business? And that's both exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Right. So that's the question. And we've got, the thing is OKRs, the system, I teach this sometimes. So I teach a lot of system stuff and geeky stuff on the side, but I don't anymore, but I know about them. And because I used to help with the operations at a lot of these companies. And I do for myself a system of OKRs. I think quarters are a really beautiful way of tracking things. You have enough time to figure out if what you're doing is working, but you're not wasting so much time as to find yourself in a hole and say, how did I get here? And lean startup and MVP and all of those principles are very similar. So for me, I set up my annual goals and I said, okay, and this was a hard question to figure out, but it's like, what do we have? Where do we have to be by the end of the year to know that this project is working?
Yeah.
And it's not like, what would wild success look like? I'm not deluding myself to think that I'm going to somehow have 400,000 subscribers on my email list when we're starting at 100. I mean, that'd be cool. Like, let me manifest that. Sure. But also that's more rare. And if you set that as a metric, that's not going to be helpful to me, because then if I get 390,000 subscribers, have I failed? No. Right. So I actually set, I learned this from Danielle Laporte. I interviewed her on my podcast, and she shared, I used to think of it as like a cliff metric of like, what's the like danger zone? And she's like, no, what's the be well? Like what's like, we are still operating, we're making enough money, and we're going in the right direction. Find that number. And I did, I set it up, and it's not that many. Like it was actually really, really interesting to me to figure out that like, over the next year, there are a lot of really solid businesses that have about 10,000 subscribers that make as a business revenue between $100,000 and $200,000. And I was like, okay, so I'm not shooting for the moon here, because also that's not helpful. I'm shooting for a stable community of between 5,000 and 10,000 people in the first year, because if we do that, then we can do something interesting in 2019.
Right. That's really, and it's, I think you put this in a way that allows it to sort of evolve, but also to sort of make sure that it's going to evolve into a place that can grow. But I think I see this a lot, that people believe that all businesses are, effectively startup businesses. And the reality is like, you're building I hate the word lifestyle business, but you're just building a business. And frankly, like
just a business,
Yeah,
like
why does it have to be a lifestyle business or not? It's basically just a business. And like by labeling it one way or the other, it sort of doesn't matter. But what you're basically, I would say it this way, is you're basically giving yourself a shot to play the next round of this. Like if after a year at a certain point, like then I can go again, and then I can go again and go again. And whereas like there's some kind of magical thing, and I get this from my own startup experience, which is like, I think about some kind of like, what's the future state? And for me, what I'm doing now is like, I just want to keep doing it again next year. And if I get to do that, like I have succeeded to the moon.
Yes, 1,000%. And there's a couple interesting things in here. You mentioned constraints. And I'm looking at a year ahead where my husband and I are thinking about having another kid. Yeah. And he's not going to take this one. Like, it's still going to be me. So there's very real constraints. Is what does it look like to be a mother of two? What does it look like to be pregnant and growing this thing? I'm not currently pregnant, but like I'm preparing for the potential possibility. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? And how do I design what this looks like? And for me, pregnancy is really hard. I go to sleep at like 7 and I wake up at like 9. And I used to be a college swimmer. I used to get up at 5 all the time. And so it just kind of cuts back on the allowable time, the available time of getting stuff done. But it makes the question more interesting of like, okay, how much time do you really have? And what's first? What are you going to spend it on? And so I like imagine that you're like putting out all your different, I don't know, jars of Play-Doh, right? I've got this blue jar over here and this green jar over there and this red jar over there. And I've got all these like awesome colors that I can play with in building my business. But what I have to do is I have to line them all up and they have to go in a specific order because I can only do one thing right now because I only have so much time. And I start to line them up and figure out, I need a better analogy than Play-Doh. That just came into my head, but we'll work on it.
Like we're gonna. So I got it right away. I was like, oh yeah, Play-Doh. She's talking about Play-Doh.
No, Play-Doh. We're playing with Play-Doh. But like, I'll come up with one that really makes sense because you have to like line them up. But so if one of them is the public speaking that I do, and one of them is the teaching that I do, because I teach often, I'm in the city, by the way, I'm sure you can hear the like honking
it makes me feel like this is real.
Well, it's 2:45 in the afternoon, so it's about to be school pickup time. And I live on Broadway in New York City. So right about this time, you might also hear like lots of cheering and jeering. And I have noise blocking curtains, by the way. And so this is through that. But so you'll also hear kids at the bus station because it's that time of day, which I don't mind because I love knowing like what time of day it is and who people are
like
in the universe.
Built-in clock here.
But back to Play-Doh. So you're lining everything up. One of them's teaching. One of them's speaking. One of them's making the podcast. One of them's running the mastermind. One of them is writing articles, which is a marketing thing. One of them is business development. Like there are all of these different activities that I can be doing to grow the business and effectively all of these different businesses that I could be running. A public speaking business, a writing business, being an author, all of this. And when I started to line them up and I looked at the relationships between them, like if I do this one first, does it make the next one better or easier? If I do this one, how does it affect the other ones? And I realized that starting with a podcast has positive outcomes for so many other things that I do.
Right.
It's research for my book. It's generative for articles that I write in the future. When I'm on maternity leave and my podcast is out there in form for people to continue to download and find, people can find me and invite me to speak. Right. So I'm setting myself up for a future in 2019. And so I get to reply to people who say, hey, do you want to do a public speaking gig? I say, no, I'm not doing any speaking in 2018 because no traveling, like pregnant, too hard. Yeah. But I can do a podcast or we can book for 2019. Because you asked me to be on a podcast, I said yes, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Right? I feel more lucky now.
Oh, no, it's just because it's so much easier to be able to slot it in. I can do it from my mic. Yep. I've got an hour and I'm not traveling, a whole day over here, prepping a whole speaking gig, having to be on at a particular time, all of that jazz. But it doesn't mean I can't speak in my career. Right. And I'm even getting better at it by doing the podcasts. You see how I'm putting these pieces together? So you line up all this Play-Doh and you're like, oh, there's a certain order that really helps. A better analogy that now comes to me is chess. Right? It's just chess moves.
Yeah. What I love about it is you think back 2.5 years ago in that this all started from scratching a personal itch, and like you pulled on the thread and suddenly you're like, this is like, MVP, like not like high level stuff that you're getting to think about from a new area. And I think people who think like, oh, whatever, like personal experiences, yeah, those are kind of interesting. You're sort of pulling on this thread and still in the midst of trying to figure it all out. But it's fascinating the depth and level, how quickly you've gotten to this point.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the coolest things about like making, and entrepreneurship is just making in another form, right? You're always making things. One of the coolest things is that by making, you learn more. And my husband goes to wood shop every week. There's like a high school right next to us that has this whole wood shop, and he goes and he makes stuff. And the first time he goes, he learns how to, the first thing he made this bench, and he started cutting all the short pieces first. And then he was like, oops, I shouldn't have done that. Like you need to cut the long pieces first, because otherwise you don't end up with long enough pieces because you cut all the short pieces off of these 2x4s. But he didn't know till he did it.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, it's a good thing I'm just making a bench and I ordered pine because it's cheap wood. And like, so, and he builds his way up to the maple or the mahogany table. And it's by making something that you get the skills. It's not by like thinking and planning and dreaming and wondering. It's by just getting in there and doing, okay, I'm going to make these things. And you get to ask more interesting questions. And for me, in making this podcast, like, it's not like I'm going to come back to you in 3 months and be like, hey, Eric, I got it all, figured it all out, like wrapped it up. Like then I'm going to be asking like, how do I scale sponsorships? And how do I manage a team effectively? Right. And what does a maternity leave policy look like if you're an idealistic organization that believes that you should have the best? Like, how do I model that as a human running a business, right? All of these things are just going to be, and to me, isn't that the best thing? Like I want to learn for a living and I get to.
Yeah. Yeah. What does Satya Nadella always says? I want to hire learn-it-alls, not know-it-alls.
Oh.
And I think it's a great way to think about life. I think you sort of get to do it in a way that is like letting you learn, and that's we're lucky we get to do that every day. Yeah,
it's the deepest, I think, privilege to be able to learn for a living.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, this has been so amazing. And I like I said, it's been I've known you for a while, but sort of watching this experience and it's been fun to sort of see this evolve in real time a little bit as it's kind of, you've been very public sharing what's going on, I think, which is part of the magic of it, but it's neat to sort of dive in a little bit more. And I'm excited to see for 2018. And I think, do check out, the sort of Startup Pregnant podcast series and be a sponsor. I always go in and be a sponsor because I think these are the kind of ways that we can build different audiences and things like that. So she needs more than 1 cup of coffee a month, people. But I think it's great, and I'm excited to sort of hear. I'd love to have you come back at the end of 2018 and sort of hear what that's been like to build in this way with this level of focus and this level of rigor, because I think you're thinking about it in a way that could, will teach a lot of people.
Oh, that would be really fun. Thanks for asking such great questions too.
I try. I'm a parent like you. You and I have sort of, we're living the same life. So I think it's sort of fun I like talking to other people that can empathize with the life we're doing. So it's always good. And I'm glad to do it with you.
Amazing. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.